Welcome to Definitely Maybe Agile, the podcast where Peter Madison and David Sherrock discuss the complexities of adopting new ways of working at scale. Hello, everybody. I'm here with Dave again, and we're joined by Leandro, and I'm looking forward to an interesting conversation. So how about we get started by Leandro, give a quick introduction to yourself.
That's awesome. Thank you, Peter, and thank you guys for having me today. I'm Lean, and I'm the CEO and founder of Lana Talent. So in Lana, we basically help small, medium businesses, startups with their talent needs. We specialize in the Latin American talent. So, I've done more than 15 years of recruiting in LATAM. And so, big corporate companies, Accenture, for example. And then I've slowly moved into smaller companies until I founded my own. And so now I try to bring sort of all that experience and value to other smaller businesses that maybe don't have the infrastructure that Accenture had to hire in Latin America, right?
Can you maybe just, rather than jump straight away from what you're describing there, Leandro, is just talk a little bit about what are the typical needs? So again, we're going to have conversations about teams, and I'm just wondering whether your clients are typically trying to source teams or they're looking for individual contributors on those teams. Maybe just share a bit about that.
Yeah, I would say, it depends on two things, right? One, the scale of the company and the stage. And then two, whether they're used to, the remote model. We do mainly staffing. And so maybe companies are not used to staffing. And so I would say smaller companies, and at a growth stage, they typically go with individual contributors. And then as they continue to grow and they see it works, they decide to scale that. And so maybe they hire, a developer, one, and then 3 months later, they want the second person. And then, a year later, they want the full team, right? And then, we also see that with companies that might be bigger, a few hundred people, but don't have talent in Latin America or never staffed. And so, in the region. And so they start with one, they give it a go. If they see it works for them, then they grow the team. You then have, companies that are more used to having remote talent, maybe not in Latin America, elsewhere, but they're used to working remote. And so what they typically do is, they already know how to manage, they have, processes, and they have a very dynamic culture to ensure that it works, and, onboarding to help them be successful. And so they already go into, let's do a 5-people team, right? A tech, I say tech because it's maybe the most known and common, but, you see this across the board, a tech lead, and then, 4 individual contributors, a mix of senior and junior. So it really depends on a couple of things. I've seen both. I would say for the most part, companies start, and the type of clients we serve start with one, and then they grow it from there.
And as I said, we were chatting about this. I'm really interested in the team dynamics and how they build up. What do you look for, if I can jump into the team side? Maybe what's your experience about how to create great teams? Let's just start something with that focus. You're talking to somebody, they want to create great teams. What would you talk to them about? What would you recommend?
Yeah, so I think there's 2 things for the most part, maybe even 3. The first one is the basics, right? So what are the skills that you need in that role, right? So if I need a content creator, well, what type of content do they need to create? What type of experience do they need? Is it industry specific or not? So first you start with those sort of basic skills, right? I think that's the foundational piece, and that's for the most part where many SMBs stay. And that's where they mostly fail, right? Because you can have a list of skills, a checklist, but then you're not going to have the right person, and you're definitely not going to build the right team. And so the second part is what we focus a lot on, and what I think, makes a big difference, which is the cultural fit. And I always talk about cultural fit and cultural add, right? So cultural fit is all around, does this person, can this person navigate the dynamics of the company, right? And so, you might be a team of people that just are super direct and tell things to their face. And if you have someone that can handle that, then they're not going to be a good fit, right? So that's the cultural fit part. The cultural add is, well, if you're a team of extroverts, maybe an introvert is good, or vice versa, right? Or if you have people that like to propose ideas, and which is great, and they innovate, but then you need someone that's really big on execution. And so you try to complement the things that you already have, right? That never works unless you have clarity on what that is. And that's also one of the things that we see a lot, right? So companies are, we want to help them find someone that's the right cultural fit. and cultural add, but they don't know what their culture is all about. And so it really starts by assessing, the culture of your own business and company. They're all different. They're all unique. And then with that, you can go out to the market and find the right person. There's a lot of things that come after hiring, right? I'm just focusing on hiring right now. There's a lot of things after that, but that's where it all starts, because if you don't really know that, then you can talk about, yes, I want someone that's the perfect cultural fit, but what is my culture, right?
Yeah. How do you help companies with those different processes, because you mentioned a few different things there. One, the assessing the candidate for cultural fit, but there's also the assessing the organization. How do you go through that process?
What we basically do is we first ask, right? So I think the first thing is, have you already gone through a sort of definition of maybe what the current culture is and what is the culture you want to have? And depending on where they are, we approach it differently, right? There's a lot of maybe smaller companies that have done their due diligence, to put it somehow. And that typically happens when you have a mix of founders that, sort of come more from the entrepreneur world, and then some of the founders or the team that come from the corporate world, right? So when you get that kind of mix, you typically have the entrepreneur person that it's, execution, a doer, it's go, go, go. And then the corporate side, that's more, well, okay, so let's build a couple of processes and let's think about a couple of the longer term decisions that will impact what we do. And so, we typically, when we have those type of businesses and startups have that mix in the founders, they typically have their work done. So we all have, all we have to do is ask, right? When they don't, we do try to go through a bit of an assessment. So we invest time with them to discuss with them and with their team to discuss what it feels like to work there on a day-to-day basis, right? Because it's not the same what maybe the leadership and the CEO want the culture to be than what it actually is. And so you have to talk about with the people what it feels like to work there, right? And how they would describe their company to someone, they're talking to. And so all of those things, once you have those conversations, you then try to curate that into a few very clear lines on, yes, we're a dynamic team. We prioritize solutions over problems. We like to have open conversations, but we're very careful and respectful when we talk to people. And, sometimes we take a bit of a longer time than we should to make some decisions, which is fine, right? And so with that, we go to the market and talk to candidates. And when we do that, the way we ensure that we're finding the right fit is doing deep assessments, right? So we do it ourselves. We have a few lovely AI tools to help us with that, but we also provide, there is competency interviewing, and so we provide our partners an overview based on the skills they're looking for, not only hard, but really soft skills, what type of questions they should be asking and what they need to be looking for. And so it's not only us, but it's them, and we complement. So if I'm going to look at whether someone is agile, then you're going to look at whether they're good, how they work with the team, right? And so we're going to look at different things throughout the process, and then we're going to put all of that together and make a decision that's as structured as possible, never without risk, right? Talent decisions always have some level, but that's at a very high level how we do it and how we help, our partners.
I feel like at the moment, it feels like we're just peppering you with questions. So the reality is that, so Peter and I have lots of conversations about, agile teams, about small, dedicated cross-functional teams. And I think, we've had such really, really good experiences of both productivity, innovation, sort of contribution that these small, dedicated teams can have. Is this something that you see in the market? Do you see that same thing? Or is it really just the agile and DevOps folks that see that? Or do you see the same sort of behaviors on a team?
Yes, but I think some functions are typically, even in 2025, slower than others. So, if you think about agility and work dynamics, and I'm going to talk about what I do, right, which is recruiting and talent, which I think it's a perfect example. We, in a lot of senses, we still hire like it's, 1999, right? We have the same job description. It's a waterfall approach, right? So you get the job description, you have a need, you then build the job description, and then you move on to, the entire process and how you collaborate with other teams, because hiring is something that, belongs to multiple teams, tends to be very slow, very bureaucratic, right? What we've seen is the the most agile teams are definitely the ones that collaborate cross-function. When you do, for example, recruiting, but very close with, for technology profiles and are very close to CTOs, they have a very different dynamics in terms of working. And so that, sort of you get that cascade, or let me rephrase that cascade, but I don't want to use words like pandemic, for example, but it's contagious, right? So the dynamics and the agility. And so that's also the cultural part, right? If you get teams to collaborate closely, and then you have, maybe a team product and, and tech, they typically have agile methodologies. And so they bring that to other functions, as long as you're able to make them collaborate and work closely, right? If not, if they work as silos, then that's never going to get across to other teams. And so you need to break those silos to make it work. And I do believe that's also culture, right? You have some companies that work with silos and others that work with, more cross-functional, project-based agile methodologies, and those tend to work better for everyone, right? Because again, it's not only the tech teams or the product teams; it just goes to marketing and to finance, and so that's how you build a culture that that's relevant for everyone, that can have an impact to your business in all of the areas of the team.
So if a customer comes to you and says, "Hey, I want a team," do you look at how the organization is operating today and think about what sort of ways of working they might have in place, how they look at engaging, whether having an agile team coming in would make more sense than maybe a more directed product team, maybe?
We do, right? And I think for some companies, they just need something that, again, if you don't have, and that's fair, it may be possible. I always say there's, not every company is for every person, and not every person is for every, right? And that's a cultural part, right? And so you might have companies that are more agile, and the cultural add. So having someone that's a bit more structured will work and help them maybe build processes that are sustainable and scalable. And other companies, that's the exact opposite. Now, having said that, what we do is, this assessment process, we go through that. It's, when you're on the outside, it's always hard, right? Because, you can always recommend something, but the business needs to make that call. So that's where, I think this is, not only for me and, the staffing and recruiting industry, but, even within, bigger companies, HR needs to have a seat on the table, right? And so that's something that has been discussed for a long time in the broader HR industry. How do you get HR leaders and talent leaders in the table, in the conversation, so that they're not, basically order takers? And so the business tends to, I believe, many times neglect, business leaders tend to neglect the value and the impact of these talents. So from my side and from our side, when we're on the outside, we can recommend, and we do the assessment, and we recommend. They make the call at the end of the day, right? And what we try to different from, for example, from other companies is, we do recruiting. Typically in the recruiting industry, you give, a guaranteed. So if the person leaves within 3 months, then we'll replace it for free. That we messed up somehow together, so we'll replace. We typically do that longer. We do 5 or 6 months guarantee, simply because we also believe that we do a good assessment at the beginning. But it really depends on the business making that decision. And I think I've seen it. So for example, I used to work at Pedido Ya. Pedido Ya is your DoorDash of Latin America, right? Market leader, they're great. I joined there to lead their talent function. They were at hyper growth stage from 2000. We took it to 6,000, right? And one of the things we saw early on is there was a lot of resistance from the business to invest the time in discussing with our talent team the development plans, the growth plans, the headcount growth, the profiles they needed, or even going to the now when we started to talk in business language, then that changed. So for example, we started to talk about the impact of making it about hire, right? So if you make it about hire, it can cost you, up to the entire annual salary. Now, you're never going to know what.
I just wanted to pick up on, I think you said this statement, and it has to do with everything that you're just talking about. And I think I kind of let it go through my brain, and my brain keeps going back to it, which is you said that recruitment, talent acquisition is a lot like it's 1999. And I feel like that was that little thing, and then it kind of drifted off. And I'm thinking, well, it's a really interesting observation, because if I think of how organizations have changed, they've changed like hugely in the last 2 decades, 2 to 3 decades. And you're describing part of that talent acquisition, which maybe the expectations at least haven't changed. What is it that you want to see change, or what do you see change in the organizations that are at the cutting edge of that field?
So I think one of the biggest things is, so I would say two things, right? One is the value and relevancy that we give to the function, right? So many times business leaders don't realize, but for the most part, and most companies, and this is just high level average, you replace between 20 to 30% of your organization on a yearly basis, right? So 2 or 3 people out of 10, they're leaving for any reason, and you're getting 2 or 3 new ones, right? So that's a lot of people changing every single year, right? And then the impact in terms of revenue growth, understanding that if you have diverse talent, you typically have 30 to 40% higher revenue, those kinds of things, right? So many times the business leaders, don't really realize the impact that talent decisions have. And so I think, many strategic decisions are being made without that in mind. We've seen the trend, right? So for example, pandemic hit 2020, layoffs all across the board, shrinking talent teams, for example, and then suddenly you saw that grow from one day to the next. And the impact of that shrinking and growing and hiring and firing, that's massive in terms of engagement, in terms of tenure, but also in terms of performance and business results, right? And outcomes. And so I think that's part one, really understanding and putting it, as a top priority when you're making business decisions. The second part is having a more holistic view to talent. We typically have talent acquisition, and that's one silo. And then you have talent development, that's a different silo. And then functions, talent functions tend to be separate. And, many of us in this industry have been advocating for a long time that it should be one single talent function that looks at the entire journey. Because at the end of the day, you can look at, just making a simple example, you can look at your company and know where you hire people from in terms of, which companies or which channels use, for example, referrals, and whether people that you hire through a specific channel stay longer and perform better and grow more, right? And the way you do that is connecting the dots, right? And, I can look at my development plans for the team and think about which skills I'm developing and growing. But then if I don't connect that with my hiring strategy, do I need to reskill? Do I need to, build or buy or borrow? If you don't connect those dots, then you're not making the right decisions, right? And so we hire for X, but then we assess, and, evaluate performance for Y, right? That doesn't make any sense. And so I think that's something that really needs to change. And there have been, there are some companies that do it, which is great. And you definitely see the difference, right? Because you hire for the right things and you develop people for the right things. And then when they leave for the right reason. But for the most part, you see those functions being siloed, separate strategies. And again, when you connect that with the business or HR not having a seat at the, table and making strategic business decisions, that's where it all breaks.
Is there anything about the actual processes pieces you would change to around how you connect the two, where we've got this? Because you've been talking about the cultural fit of the organization and the characteristics of the people we're looking to hire. And there's this piece of how do we connect these and make sure we get the right puzzle piece for the jigsaw.
Executing the right process is absolutely relevant to this, right? And so a lot of times hiring is intuition, and many companies, I would say, it needs to be 80% process, 20% intuition, right? Because there's always that fuel that you get from people, and that's super relevant. You need to listen to that. But process is absolutely relevant, Peter. And to your point, I think, there's a couple of things here, right? So executing a process is not just having the right steps, but the complementary of those steps. And so I always talk about when you're going to hire someone, you need to have consistent assessment. So how do you assess different skills? But then what do you assess at each stage, and who is going to look at what? And then how you're going to share that feedback with others, and how you're going to evaluate objectively every single candidate, right? And so you need scorecards, and you need methodology for interviewing. You need agreement between all the parts that are part of that. So, from a process perspective, that's how, that's everything you need. And then, of course, there's a couple of nuances and, the basics, right? So step 1, step 2, we go out there and hunt for talent through this channel, and then, interview 1, 2, 3, I don't know, all of that, right? What happens for the most part is these conversations to agree on all of that requires time, right? You need people to sit down. You need business leaders and hiring managers to actually learn how to ask questions, which questions they need to ask, and what they need to be looking for. They don't do it, right? For the most part, right? A lot of leaders are great at it. But for the most part, you see that they don't invest the time because they're not necessarily hiring all the time, and that's fair. In certain businesses, you have business leaders that are hiring all the time. In those cases, they better invest the time to learn it. But many times, it's one hire every couple of months, and so it does require time investment. And if you ask me, of course, it's time well invested in that process and in learning what you need to do. But many times, business leaders don't do it, right? And so that's where it all breaks. I've seen recruiting teams, for the most part, have the basics covered, but then getting the rest of the organization mobilized and on board, that's one of the most difficult parts of achieving the outcomes.
I find it fascinating as we learn. So as you go through an organization and you look at an organizational structure and the work they're trying to do, and you understand processes and work to improve them and so on. The couple of things that really jump out. One is that you can become an expert in whatever that process is, every element of it. And we're really drilling into the talent acquisition and talent support side in this conversation. But also there's the business cost. Sometimes we see these things as they're supporting the function of the business, they're supporting what the business does, but we see them as costless in some way. They're just, we're getting people in, we're backfilling, we're doing whatever it might be. And I really appreciated where you're touching on understanding the cost incurred by doing it poorly in terms of lost time, lost ramp up times, looking for new roles, continuously having to find new employees or new talent to join the team. But also in terms of if you do it right, how that really helps land on the team and deliver really well, right? Now, you mentioned in our introduction when we were just chatting around data and being a bit of a fan of data. So given that conversation around value and value to an organization, do you have any favorite anecdotes you can share of data that shows the value of doing these things right, or the value of teams, whatever it might be?
Yeah, I have a bunch, right? And to be honest, I always have sort of my go-to, not only stories but data points around this, because it's fascinating when you think about it. It's just so crystal clear. I'll share an example of one of my previous companies, tech company. We were seeing very high turnover. This was a retail company, so it's in retail you typically see high turnover, but this was 70-80% turnover every year. So think about that, right? 8 out of 10 people were just leaving every single year. You had to replace them. We were spending as a company hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, because again, it's not only what you invest in the recruiting, but it's what you invest in training the people and when they leave, and the operational gap when they leave. And so we realized that, again, when you think about retail, it's fast paced, right? And so, you need to find someone very, very quickly. It's typically, in terms of the skills you're looking for, it's simpler. You don't look for very senior people, at least not for the stores. And so, it tends to be a process that doesn't receive the attention that it needs, right? And so what we realized was, when we did the estimation, right, 80% turnover every single year was costing, a lot of money. And so we basically changed that process. We discussed with the business. We basically, I remember it was slightly north of $1 million, to be very, very, very precise with the number. We realized that the turnover was really around the engagement that people were having with their teams. And so roughly 50-60% of people, when they were leaving, we did exit interviews. And so it was all about, I don't connect with my team. I don't have fun. I have a bad time here. I just don't want to stay, right? And again, in this industry where you can so easily move and, turnover is normal, then if you have 50-60% of people just leaving because of that, that's something you need to solve for. What we did was basically an assessment. We asked people, what they enjoyed. We did it both for people that were leaving, like what was missing, and then for people that were staying, what they enjoyed and what they liked. Out of that, there were 2 or 3 things that related, to one was very much about work dynamics dynamics on a day-to-day basis. So it was all about work, and there was no space to connect with others, to meet, to enjoy, to celebrate success together. The other was around exactly that cultural fit, right? So you had people that were very high energy, and then you had people that were lower energy, more introverts, and they felt exposed many times with that collaboration in maybe team environments. And so we just made some adjustment. We realized because of the culture of the company, we needed more of that sort of high energy type profile. And so we just added, this was very simple, we just added 2 or 3 questions in the interview process. What you look for in the team. This one I always like because it's a very simple way to ask about the cultural fit without asking, what is the right cultural fit for you? And it's, what did you enjoy most about your previous work or job, and what didn't you? Right. And so those questions basically helped us assess them better. And it was like 2, 3 questions in the interview process. And throughout the first year, we were able to reduce turnover, which again, it's retail, so it's still high, to about 50, 60%. But the interesting thing was that the turnover, because of those reasons we discussed, which was 50, 60%, throughout the first year we saw that decrease to about 25, 30%, right? So that went to half. I don't honestly remember the exact dollar associated to the savings we generated, but I can tell you it was very, very significant, because after that we had our business leaders, especially, the CFO, asking to do a bit more of that, right? And so that was a very, very clear example to me of how you can make a change to the business when you think about talent in a more strategic.
I was going to say, I think there's some similar techniques, right, that we use, right, to when we start to talk to teams, we start to ask very similar questions about what are you enjoying, what's working here, what's not, and what do you want to see out of this as we think about how to move forward. We also use techniques like retrospectives to look back at like, what has the team been doing? What could we do next? What would be even better? And start to use techniques like that to try and help them go. Before we started talking as well, you were talking about a little bit about remote work and sort of how that's impacted by this. So what sort of advice or guidance do you have when you're bringing people in to work remotely?
So there's 2 things that I believe make a big difference. And what, by the way, one comment, Peter, to what you just mentioned, that's exactly how we need to think about talent, right? Because I'm talking about recruiting and acquisition, but the conversation needs to continue afterwards, right? And so exactly what you described, right? After 3 months, 6 months, or depending on the leader, we need to be having those conversations all the time, right? And by the way, connecting the conversation from, hey, when we talked, when you were joining the company, you said that you wanted to learn, I don't know, AI, how to incorporate AI. Now everyone's talking about AI, how to incorporate AI to your role and marketing. Are you doing that? Do you have the resources that you need? Are you enjoying it? So connecting those thoughts along the way and having those conversations super relevant. So I think that's great. Now going back to your question, there's for remote teams, I would say there's 2 things that really make a big difference. One is onboarding. Many times, we, especially in remote environments, talent is hired. There's no second thought to, well, what happens their first day, their first week, and their first. And so building a very comprehensive and detailed onboarding plan where you not only give them sort of the tools and, you don't only, which you need to do, right? Describe their targets and objectives and discuss about the role in detail and process, whatever, but you also connect them with other people, right? So have a buddy program, right? Tell them who they need to talk to for different things, create an organizational map that's not only focused on delivery and executing, but it's also focused on building meaningful connections. And so, when you do that with the onboarding process, that makes a huge difference to people. It's interesting, but again, being data-driven, I want to honor that. About 80%, you see an increase in retention of about 80% when you have good. That's huge, right? The other is after people join and to incentivize good team dynamics, being very intentional with creating spaces, and connection between the team members that are not only focused on work. And so, when you work in office and there's things that are very hard to replace or impossible, I'm a big supporter of remote work, but I also believe there's a lot of value in being in person. When you're in person, you have, you talk about the movie you watched yesterday, right? And you talk about the season finale of The Last of Us. I won't spoil it, I promise. But, that happens when you're live with someone. When you're remote, people get on a meeting and they work and, they are, we done? Yes, we need anything else? No, thank you, goodbye. And there's no real connection. And so you need to be, every business needs to be, when you have remote teams, very intentional in creating spaces that are dedicated fully to building team connections, to engaging, and driving culture. So maybe, you do a 30-minute online game, right? We one of my teams, once we did an online escape. And, I'm in Argentina, I was here, and then, someone was in Poland, and there was another person in the US. It was so much fun. And it was 30 minutes, very well invested. We didn't get any work done, but we did escape the room. And, we talked about it afterwards, right? And so, there's a lot of small things you can do, but you need to be intentional, because if you're not, then it goes, maybe 1 week, 2 weeks, full month, that teams and people didn't connect with each other for anything outside of their actual work. Engagement is not the same, right? I mean, you don't feel like you're part of a team when you connect with someone and you have fun with them and you call them a friend or a good, let's say, good work colleague. Let's not even say friend. It feels different, right? The game is something that you're playing together, and so you're willing to go maybe the extra mile. But you need to be intentional with creating those, those environments on a daily basis, I would say. Or definitely in a week.
Couldn't agree more.
I'm just smiling, remembering all those weird game things that we were doing before.
Yes.
They were.
So I guess one of the other pieces that you were talking about as well earlier in the conversation is the work that you do with Latin American talents. I mean, you're bringing those up. Do you see any differences bringing with Latin American talent, coming and working with either with North American teams or with other parts of the world?
I feel like I sound like a broken record, but I would say culture. So no, I think, in general, so there's a couple of things, right? So culture is definitely one of those, right? Of course. But, people in Latin America are very used to working remotely. They've been doing it for a long time, which, in some countries more than others. So for example, Argentina, Colombia, Mexico. So they're more used to this type of work. And in general, they're very agile, but they bring, so I always say, there's a good cultural fit between, many people in certain Latin American countries and the US, but then there is a surplus, which has to do with what, people go through here. For example, I'm in Argentina, and politics, economics here are very, very unique. And so, people in this country tend to be super resilient, and that's something that they bring as an add, right? I think, but I think there are other countries where it's not a great fit. So for example, Peru or Ecuador, even in some parts of Mexico, in the US, people tend to be more direct in their communication. Maybe, many times the working is more sort of horizontal, and in some of these countries is more vertical. They're very careful in maybe responding to someone that's higher up. They're very hierarchical. If you're a manager and I'm an analyst, then I might not speak my mind, right? And so those are a few of the gaps that exist with some countries, not all, but in some countries that I find, to be a challenge sometimes. The other thing that I would say is sometimes from the other side, I've seen when you're in the US, or, we focus on US and Canada, right? When you're, let's say, North America, and you haven't really been exposed to Latin America or South America, there is a lot of things that you don't really know about the day-to-day reality of people here. And so I have seen certain frictions when it comes to, and I'm going to make a silly example, let's say internet connection, right? Internet might drop. It's not, maybe in certain, for the most part, it's great, right? But in certain countries, it's not as stable, right? And so maybe the reaction you get is, well, what's going on? You're not working. Or in reality, well, I mean, let's say I used Peru as an example before. I'm going to keep on using it. Well, I'm in Peru, and maybe internet is not as stable 1 or 2 days a month. I just, it drops, right? And I have a problem and I just can't get online, right? And so, not understanding those local sort of realities can create some level of friction in the collaboration, because, from one side you get, well, this person is not working or they don't want to work. And from the other, it's, well, I just, my internet dropped. There's nothing I can do, right? And understanding those realities is, I think it's important. So I would say those are two things that, that's why I always advise, I think it's important to advise on the right countries in the region and understand the needs of a company or a business to recommend that, and then you make your decision, right? Well, people in Peru are going to hate me, but let's say Peru, right? Let's continue to talk about Peru. Well, it might be more cost effective, which is great, right? So what is your priority? Is it that it's cost effective, or is it that the person is going to be online 100% of the time? Internet is never going to fail. Well, in that case, yeah, maybe some places of Peru might not be the best, right? But it's still going to be more cost effective. So you need to make that call, and sometimes those decisions are not made consciously and in the right way, and that creates friction along the way. And that's when, after a month or 2 months, things are not working out and you need to make change. I think with awareness and open conversation and transparency, those things are typically solved, but it does happen.
That's awesome. I really appreciate all the sharing and learning, Leandro. It's we're at time now at the end of our podcast. So we at this point normally ask for some 3 points that our listeners can take away. And since there's 3 of us, we each get one. Yeah. So I'm going to ask you first, Dave. Dave, what would you share as your?
Oh, okay. I'm just going to jump on one of my favorite topics, which is culture. And I think we've had a number of points where we've just touched on it, but we're just ending right now with that realization of culture doesn't just necessarily mean the people. It can just be the infrastructure, even. Like every sort of touch point that we've had in the conversations, there's been that sort of layer or overview of cultural differences, which I think adds so much color and so much to the opportunities there, but sometimes can be forgotten at a cost.
Leandro, what would you add to take away from the conversation?
Yeah, I would say, if people, teams, businesses decide to build remote teams, which that's what I do. So I definitely recommend, make sure to invest the time to make it work. Right? Make sure that you know what you need, what works for you. Make sure that when you're hiring someone, you do proper onboarding. Hiring remote or working remote only works when you're very intentional in investing the time to make it work. If not, it's just a slogan. It doesn't work. Don't waste your time, right? So I would say, if you do remote, invest the time, make it work. It's great. If you're not going to invest the time, don't work with the remote team.
I think for my point, I liked the part where you were talking about the cultural assessment of the organizations as you look at them, and in particular that it's not just about cultural fit or however you look at, is this person going to be able to work within this organization, but also how might they add to the culture? Might there be differences where they can bring a different perspective or a different mindset to the organization might be of value, and that understanding that as a critical piece of thinking about who's the person that's the most effective for these roles, because it's a very, very impactful decision that you're making. So thank you both for a wonderfully enlightening conversation as always. And our listeners can reach us at feedback@definitelymaybeagile.com or come visit our website at definitelymaybeagile.com. And I look forward to next time.
Thanks again, Leandro.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Peter, for having me. Great conversation.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Definitely Maybe Agile, the podcast where your hosts, Peter Madison and David Sharrock, focus on the art and science of digital, agile, and DevOps at scale.